In the 1971 playoffs, the Dallas Cowboys played it patiently, Minnesota style, and the Vikings lost to their own mistakes. The shoe was on the other foot, but only briefly, because in a season of adversity, the Vikings continued to be winners. They won because they got something extra from all of their able men. Men like Alan Page, number 88, whose performance in 1971 earned him the honor of being the first lineman ever to be named the most valuable player in the NFL. While Page played with matchless ability, Bob Grimm was the little engine that could, picking up a ton of slack after the injury to Gene Washington. After the season, Grimm was a part of the trade for Fran Tarkenton, and to his credit, it was as much his Viking attitude as his ability that made him attractive to the New York Giants. An attitude that spans an unbroken line from the original Viking, Grady Alderman, to their newest All-Pro, Ron Yeri. Stu Voigt, with his soft hand, stepped into the open, easing the year-long loss of tight end John Beasley. Dave Osborne's sore knee was not so worrisome after Clinton Jones stepped near the head of his class among running backs in the NFL. "1971 produced a list of young achievers: Charlie West, Bobby Bryant, Carl Gersbach, Ed White, Bob Lee. All of them proved to be the kind of players Bud Grant described back in 1967, in the beginning, when he said the Vikings must be men who are respected as much for their ability as for their willingness to give something extra. Usually, durability refers to a season, in the stretch, or to a career. But in the Monday night opener at Detroit, it was durability that won the Vikings' most important game, the first one. Minnesota was in trouble and trailing 13-0. But even so early in the season, durability had taken roots, and the Vikings began coming back. With hard resolution and with about 6 good legs between them, the offensive line plugged into the Detroit rush like feeding sharks, and Mick Tingelhoff, Ed White, Grady Alderman, Doug Davis, Milt Sunday, and Ron Yeri bought the necessary time. Quazzo spent it prudently, getting the Vikings on the board before halftime. Bob Grimm, Ed White, and the other stand-ins were proving their worth. The Vikings still trailed, but closer, and the air raid continued. Late in the fourth quarter, Fred Cox tied the game. The game breaker came from Bill Brown. Although the 10th leading lifetime rusher in the NFL did not carry the football that night, he hung Lem Barney high enough for Carl Kasulke to splatter it loose. And it was an old pro's willingness to go on special teams that represented the difference between the Vikings and the Lions on opening night. For the 7th time in their last 7 meetings, the Lions walked off losers. The next week, Bob Grimm rolled through the Bears for 58 minutes. But the seldom smile was lost. when Kent Nix hit Dick Gordon twice for touchdowns in the final minutes. Even the most loyal Viking fans were touched with dismay until the third week when the Purple Gang buffaloed the Bills, scoring their first shutout of the season. In Philadelphia, the Vikings continued their attention to the 100 tiny details that win football games. The Eagles went down harder than expected. But Minnesota waited patiently, and when Philadelphia cracked, the Vikings sunk them in a sea of defense. While the Philadelphia win was most satisfying for the ex-Eagle Carl Gersbach, it was in the fifth game at Green Bay that number 56 began to look like a steal from the waiver grab bag. The Purple Gang forced mistakes, and the offense cashed them in for touchdowns. After the game, when Bud Grant spoke to the battered assemblage, he said, "Today we played Viking football." And the Vikings had turned the corner just in time, for next they played the world champion Baltimore Colts before a Monday night television audience, in a game the Colts wanted dearly to win. Minnesota struggled to a 10-0 third period advantage, with number 83, Stu Voigt, carrying most of the offensive load, leading up to Dave Osborne's short touchdown run. From then on, Baltimore took charge of the football, but the Purple Gang kept control of the game. In the end, not even the masterful John Unitas could save the Colts. And Coach Grant was getting so used to these Monday night hair raisers that he ventured to look over his shoulder, and he got a scare. It was Halloween in New York, and the Giants were acting like giants. Until the final minute when Norm Snead and Bob Grimm combined for the Vikings' 6th win in 7 games. But Grant's frightful premonition came true the following week, when the Vikings dropped a game to the 49ers by a thin margin. The rematch with Green Bay was called the Pass the Miracles game. 7 times the Packers were turned away at the Vikings' goal. 2 goal line stands spearheaded by Wally Hilgenberg, 3 goal line interceptions, 1 by number 22 Paul Krause, 2 by Charlie West. A goal line fumble caused by Jim Marshall, recovered by Paul Krause, and a blocked field goal by Carl Gersbach preserved the Vikings' thin 3-point victory. It was Minnesota's 3rd shutout in 9 games, and some called it lucky. But in pro football, you've got to get good before you get lucky. And in Minnesota, miracles are made of muscle. When you come to play Minnesota, you expect to get your dishes rattled. The Vikings have always blocked and tackled and run with abandon. But in the past 5 years, they have added talent to their bravura. And in the fun of their achievements, they have grown very close in character to the hardy, outdoorsy Minnesota fans they represent. While the game has grown elsewhere as a spectacle in Romanesque proportions, in Minnesota, it remains homespun, simple, and basic. Even hours before the game, in the splendor of a Minnesota morning, there is no place like the Met. Although the styles vary between cities, it's the athletes that make the difference on the gridiron. For 3 years, number 40, Charlie West, has ranked as the finest athlete among all the Vikings, but he didn't play much. These skills were always there, but he lacked a professional's confidence. This year, West seized his chance and won his spurs as one of the Purple Gang. He led the Vikings in interceptions, and just to prove that people were correct in expecting more of Charlie West, he starred as a return man on the special teams. And now that he knew he had it, Charlie West flaunted it in New Orleans, leading the Vikings to their 8th win of the season. Returning to more comfortable weather, the Vikings took on Norm Van Brocklin's hard-nosed Falcons, and Atlanta's fate was written in the mud by Minnesota running backs. Bill Brown scored 2 touchdowns, and in the joy for that old pro's return to glory, it was widely overlooked that Clinton Jones gained 155 yards. Although Jones' statistics were not spectacular, the man with all the muscles and all the moves made it clear that he has arrived and that he will be a threat to gain more than 1,000 yards in the years ahead. The Bears' Dick Butkus has remarked that the only 2 tough backs in the league are Bill Brown and Dave Osborne. But it is a Viking trademark that all of their backs, Jones, Brown, Osborne, Jim Lindsay, Oscar Reed, and Leo Hayden, all of them know which way to go when they get the ball. A loss in San Diego set up a showdown with the Lions in the 13th game of the season. If ever a day belonged to an individual in a team sport, this day belonged to Alan Page. Page made kindling of the Lion offensive front wall. The rest of the Vikings followed his example, and the result was a rout. For the 4th time in 4 years, the Vikings were champions of the most traditionally competitive division in pro football. It is fitting that this day should have been won by the defense. For all of Minnesota's winning ways are polarized in the defense led by Captain Jim Marshall. Pro football may have been invented specifically for number 70 to play. The match is that perfect. And it should give no one comfort to know that he is now summoning himself to become a karate champion, which should make for some interesting pictures next year of Jim Marshall pulverizing quarterbacks with his feet. Carl Eller is the Vikings' menacing all-pro marvel at left defensive end. What is overlooked is that among all the Vikings, Eller is the brightest and most intense student of the game. Number 77, Gary Larson, is the very professional policeman up front who picks up after the other three. Larson gels the line as a unit. And together, inside and out, they are the best in the business. Minnesota's headlong front four is balanced by its conservative deep secondary. Number 45, Ed Shirachman, is the dean of the cornerbacks. The second senior citizen in the secondary is combative Carl Kasulke. Paul Krause is the cleverest of the deep defenders, and he is sixth for a lifetime among all interceptors in the NFL. Number 20, Bobby Bryant, plays a faultless corner. And Charlie West, the consummate athlete, is accomplished at all spots in the secondary. But the defense hinges on the linebackers. Carl Gersbach replaced Lonnie Warwick for most of the season, and well enough to earn the affectionate title of Otto the Human Hand Grenade, because when he hits, he splatters. Number 58, Wally Hilgenberg, was another gem from off the waiver list who has done steady time for the Vikings since 1968. Roy Winston, number 60, is easily hidden behind the crouching lineman. But when the ball is snapped, he looms much larger. In the 14th game of the season, the Vikings ate up the Chicago Bears. Another tight end, Bob Brown, number 89, showed he will have a hand in the future. It was the Vikings' 20th win in 24 black and blue division battles. And all in all, everybody had a hand in the victory, which is the way Bud Grant likes it. A football team for Bud Grant is a 40-man Ways and Means committee meeting for the purpose of finding new ways to win football games. The Vikings have never looked disparagingly at the ways they have won. And for Grant's part, he would like to see more new and unusual avenues explored in every game. For 1972, the king of the improvisers returns to take the reins of the now mighty Minnesota Vikings. When Fran Tarkenton left the Vikings in 1967 in return for Clinton Jones, Bob Grimm, Ron Yeri, and Ed White, both he and the Vikings lacked the necessary maturity to be a winner in the NFL. But now reunited in their prime, it is thought that Bud Grant's Ways and Means Committee may extend its schedule this year to include Super Bowl VII. For the Vikings have something extra in men like kicker Fred Cox and ball hawk Bobby Bryant. Fred Cox, like Mick Tingelhoff and others, made it with the Vikings on a second try because they refused to quit. And more men like Clinton Jones now on the verge of stardom. Jones and Charlie West and Ron Yeri. Men whose strength of will exceeds the strength of the body. Men with something extra. Something sometimes so extraordinary that one may trespass on greatness, becoming one of a kind. Such a man is Alan Page, the only lineman ever to be named the most valuable player in the NFL.